David had saved Israel from Goliath and the Philistines. King Saul's son, Jonathan, loved David, and they became the best of friends. Jonathan gave David his robe, his armour, his sword and bow and belt, and Saul put David in charge of the men of war. When the Israelite army returned home, women came out singing and dancing with musical instruments. They said, "Saul has slain thousands, and David tens of thousands." Saul was very angry when he heard this, and he became jealous of David. The next day, when David was playing music for the king, Saul had a spear in his hand. He threw it at David, but David escaped. Saul became afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but the people loved David. Saul offered to give his daughter Merab to David to be his wife, but then he changed his mind and gave her to someone else. Saul had another daughter called Michal, and she loved David. Saul sent a message to David. He could marry Michal if he killed 100 Philistines. Saul hoped David would die in the attempt, but he killed 200 Philistines. So David married Michal, but Saul continued to be his enemy. Saul told his son Jonathan and all his servants that they should kill David. Jonathan warned David about this and spoke to his father, reminding him that the Lord had saved Israel through David. Saul listened to Jonathan, but later, when David was playing music again, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. David fled away to his house. His wife, Michal, let him down through a window and then hid an idol in his bed. Saul's men came and Michal told them that David was ill. They came in and found the idol in the bed, and Saul was furious. Meanwhile, David had gone to Samuel the prophet and told him everything that Saul had done. Saul sent messengers to capture David, but God's Spirit kept turning them into prophets, and he did the same when Saul came himself. David fled away and spoke to Jonathan, who said he'd find out if his father was still determined to kill David. They also promised to show each other kindness and loyalty. The next day was a special feast, and Saul saw that David wasn't there. The next day, David still wasn't there, and Saul asked Jonathan where he was. He got angry with Jonathan, and Jonathan knew that his father still wanted to kill David. He went out into the field where David was hiding, and gave him the sign that Saul was still angry. He shot an arrow, and said to the boy who was with him, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" Then David and Jonathan cried and said goodbye to each other, and David went away. This story shows us that God's servants have enemies. People may hate us if we serve the Lord courageously. And it shows us that God is with his servants. The Lord was with David, guarding and protecting him. And it shows the kind of love we should have for God's chosen king. Just as Jonathan was so loyal and devoted to David, we should be loyal and devoted to Jesus, God's Son.